Hello class, this is the Chapter 4 lecture for CIT 171 on constraints. I'm going to go through uh, basically the entire chapter on constraints and showing you examples in Oracle. The examples are actually straight from the textbook on how to create and modify constraints in Oracle. Now, I want to make sure I'm clear that this video does not cover everything that is in the chapter and everything that you will be tested on. You need to make sure that you go back and read through the entire chapter and make sure that you understand everything in that chapter, because I'm not going to go into every detail. That would probably take several video lectures. I'm going to focus today on how you actually create these constraints in Oracle so that you can complete the homework assignment that you have from the textbook. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into Chapter 4 and discuss constraints. So constraints, what we're going to be learning about in this chapter is we add constraints to tables in our Oracle database in order to set up business rules and maintain referential integrity and accuracy in our database. So we're going to talk about constraints, talk about the different types of constraints, and how we can actually create those constraints. So again, constraints are rules used to enforce business rules, practices, and policies. So they're really set up, they're really created so that whenever you create constraints on your tables, you make sure that all of the data in your database is accurate and has referential integrity, meaning if one table references another table, we want to make sure there are rules in place so that if you're referencing, let's say, a customer number in your orders table, that customer number actually exists in the customers table. So it's a way to make sure that you don't have null values where you don't want to have null values, and that all of the data connects with each other and relates to each other appropriately. So here are the constraint types. You can have a primary key, which you guys should know. It uniquely identifies each record. The primary key cannot be null. Everything must be unique. Every value in that field or that column must be unique. A foreign key constraint. If you have a one-to-many, also known as a parent-child relationship, the constraint is added to the many table. The constraint ensures that if a value is entered in a specified column, it must already exist in the one table or the record isn't added. So we'll talk about this further, but think about it like you have a customer table, which has a list of all your customers from your Just Leave Books database, and that's the parent table. Now that each customer could have many records or child records in the orders table, for example, because each order that is generated is for a specific customer, but the customer could make multiple orders. So there could be many customers in the orders table for every one customer in the parent table. Hopefully that makes sense. But we're going to set up foreign keys to ensure that when you add a customer number to an order, that customer actually exists in the parent table, which is customers. The unique constraint, that ensures that all of the values in the specified column are unique. Now the difference between this and a primary key is that a unique constraint will allow null values, whereas a primary key will not. Then you have a check constraint. A check constraint makes sure that a specified value is true or specified condition is true in a table before data can be added. So if you wanted to make sure that a value was always greater than 0, you could add a check constraint in that says, okay, everything in the order amount field has to be greater than 0. We can't add an order for $0. So you can add that check constraint in there. Or as an example here, make sure that the order ship date can be earlier than its order date, because obviously you can't ship an order before it's actually ordered. Finally, there's a not null constraint, and what this does is it ensures that a specified column can't have a null value. So as we'll see here in a bit, in your customers table, maybe you don't want the last name and first name to be blank. So you put a not null constraint on there so that you have to make sure that first name and last name is present whenever you insert a record into that table. So we'll talk in a second about how you name your constraints and what your options are there. There's an industry standard that I'll go over a naming convention, you could say, that assists you in debugging. It helps describe what the constraint is actually referencing. If you don't enter a constraint name, Oracle will automatically create one for you, but it's in this format, sys_c, and then this small n here will be a series of numbers that the system automatically generates. So it doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what the constraint actually does. We're going to talk about when you create a constraint. So you can create it during table creation. So when you actually create the table, you add the constraints at that time. Or if you have an existing table, you can modify that table and create a constraint at that time. You can also do a column level approach or a table level approach. We'll talk about those here in a minute. So let's go ahead and just jump into creating our constraints. We'll start with primary key. Now, before we get into these examples, what you need to do is make sure that you look here in Blackboard. There are some corrected student data files that I have corrected. So let's take a look at what's in specifically this jldb_build_revised.sql file. So if you look back let me pull up both of these files so you can see them side by side. If you look back, this side over here is what we have, whenever you created your database initially, this is what you ran. And you can see that in this table, when we're creating this table customers, there's our constraints that are created. These are table level constraints that they've added in. So there's a primary key here for customer number. We're going to add that here in a second in our examples. There's also a check constraint that adds in region. So the region value must be in this list of values. So there's already constraints here. There's already constraints in the orders table. Primary keys, foreign keys have already been added. Constraints have already been added. So it's going to be difficult for you to do your examples that are in your book with those constraints. So I've modified this script on this side over here, and you can see I've taken out the constraints for each table so that we can create our own constraints in these examples. So I would go ahead and run this JLDB build revise script before we get started. Okay. So how do we do that? So let's look back on how we run these scripts. So I'm going to open up SQL+. I'm going to log in with my Scott user, password Tiger. Now, before we run the script, we need to make sure we drop our tables that already exist. If we don't drop the tables that already exist, we're going to run into more issues because they're already there. So we need to run this script which will drop each one of these tables and all of their constraints. So to do that, I'm going to use the start command. And if you remember, I've put all of my scripts in my C drive in a CIT 171 folder. So there I have my JLDB_drop. Here I have my _build_revised.sql script. So first I'm going to run the drop, JLDB_drop.sql. And you see when I run it, it drops all of the tables. Now, Account Manager and Account Manager 2, it says they don't exist because apparently I had not created them initially. So they're not there. That's okay. If you get that error, it's fine. Now I'm going to run this script to recreate the database. Now you can do this as many times as you want, and in subsequent chapters you'll need to make sure that you run scripts for that specific chapter because they will set up specific data scenarios for you to be able to do your homework. And if you ever are working with your database and everything gets hosed up, you don't know what's going on, you can just go and run the drop table script and then recreate the build using the build script, and you're back to square one, right? It's basically a way to reset all of your data. So I'm going to do start C:\\CIT171 JLDB_build_revised.sql. Run that, and now we've created all of our tables and data in our database again. Okay, so if I do select all from customers, There's all of our data. Okay, so let me get my notes up here. So let's start talking about about primary keys. Now, we saw back here in our previous script over here on this side that we had a constraint for a primary key on customer number. So why would we need a primary key on customer number? So the reason we want that is we want each one of these records to be unique. We could have multiple Jennifer Smiths. That's a fairly common name. We may have two customers who have the name Jennifer Smith. But to differentiate them in our database, we want to give them different customer numbers so we know that they're two different people that probably have two different addresses, right? So in order to do that, as it stands now with no constraints, we could add in another customer named Jennifer Smith with the customer number 1019, and it would add it to the database without issue. Well, that's a problem because now we have two records that are 1019 and we don't know which one is the correct one. So we're going to add a primary key on this customer number column that says, okay, this customer number has to be unique and it cannot be null, so it's always a unique record. So how do we do that? We're going to start by altering our tables and modifying and adding the constraints using an alter table, and then at the end I'll show you how you add the constraints when you create a brand new table. But we're going to start just by using alters. Okay, so alter table, just like you did in the last chapter. Alter table customers. I'm going to do a new line. I'm going to add constraint. Now this is where the naming convention comes in that I mentioned earlier. So the industry standard common naming convention is to do the table name where you're adding the constraint. So we're adding this constraint to the customers table. The field or column that you're referencing in the constraint that you're adding the constraint to, which is customer number. And then at the end you put what type of constraint it is. So underscore PK would be for a primary key, FK, foreign key, UK, unique key, CK for check, and NN for not null. And we'll talk about all of those in a second. But right now we're doing a primary key. Then, so after we've specified the constraint name, we're then going to put in the constraint type, which is primary key. And then in parentheses, we're going to specify the column that we're adding the constraint to, which in our case is customer number. We want to make customer number the primary key. Don't forget your semicolon, hit enter, and now we've altered the table and added the constraint to the customers table. Now let's test our new constraint here quickly to see if it's working. So I'm going to insert a record, or try to insert a record into this table. Now, we haven't really covered how to insert records yet. That will be next chapter. But just sort of follow along here with me as I insert this data. So I'm going to insert into the customers table, and then I specify the fields that I want to insert into. Customer name, last name, first name, and region. Okay, and then I'm going to insert values. Now, let's say I wanted to add another value of 1020. So the customer number 1020 is for Kenneth Falla. What if I want to add another customer number that's 1020? Our constraint should no longer let us do that because we have added it as a primary key. So I'm going to specify a last name, I'm going to specify a first name, I'm going to specify the region, add my semicolon. Oh, we have an error at line 1. A unique constraint, there's the constraint that we just added, primary key, has been violated. So you cannot enter that customer number. Okay. Now, if I wanted to do the same, I'm going to hit the up button just to save time while I'm typing here. If I want to do the same thing, but instead let's add a 1022. So a customer number we know does not exist in this table. Now when I run this, let me get to the end here. One row has been created. And if I select all from customers, now we see our new record has been created. Now, why do I have to add in the last name and first name? Well, if you recall, we still have the not null constraint added onto this customer table. So these values can't be null. We'll look at that constraint here in a little bit. Okay. What if you wanted to add a composite primary key? A composite primary key is when you have two or more fields that combined create the unique identifier on a table. So let's look quickly at the order items table. Order items. Select all from order items. Select all from order items. So you see I have an order number and an item number here. Now if you look up here, order number 1007 appears multiple times. So if I was going to create a primary key in this table, I couldn't just use order number because there's duplicates. However, if I combine order number with the item, so it's for order number 1007, they have multiple items. Item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. If I combine the order number with the item number, that creates a unique identifier. So that is called a composite primary key. So to do that, same way as I did before, alter table, order items, specify my table name, add constraint. Now I'm going to name it order items using my convention, table name underscore order number item number underscore PK. Primary key, specify the key. Now, instead of just listing order number, I do a comma and then I list item number as well. And so that creates a primary key with a composite primary key with two columns as the primary key. Okay, so those two columns combined have to be unique before a record can be entered into this table. Okay, all right, so that's primary keys. Let's talk about foreign keys. So again, a foreign key is where you reference a field in another table, usually in a parent-child or one-to-many relationship. We're going to use an example on our orders table. So if I do select all from orders, we take a look at it here. Recall there's an order number field and a customer number field. This customer number field is referencing customer numbers that are in our customer table. So in order to maintain integrity and accuracy in our database, data integrity, we want to make sure that there is not a record that gets inserted into this order table for a customer number that doesn't exist. Okay, so we need to set up a foreign key on this child table. This is the child table because there are many children. There could be many orders with the customer number 1020, but the parent customer, the customer table is the parent. It can only have one customer number, so it's one-to-many relationship. So to prevent a customer number from being added to this table that doesn't exist on the customers table, we have to set up a foreign key. So to do that, we're going to do alter table orders. That's where we're going to add the foreign key. We're going to add a constraint called orders underscore customer number underscore FK, foreign key. I'm going to specify it as a foreign key. Now, what I'm going to specify, the column I'm going to specify in parentheses here is the column in the orders table. So I'm saying the customer number field that's on the orders table, I'm going to add a foreign key constraint to that field. Okay. Now on a foreign key, I also have to say what field I'm going to reference. So it references the customers table and the customer number field on that table. So what this is saying is we're going to add a constraint on the orders table on the customer number column. And it's going to reference the customers table and the customer number column on that table. Okay? Run it. Table is now altered. So now, if we try to insert a record into this orders table for a customer number that doesn't exist, it should throw an error and not let us do it because, hey, that customer has never been in here. We haven't created a customer number with this number before. So let's test it out. I'm going to do insert into orders, the order number, the customer number, order date, values, 1021, let's just say that's the order number. And let's say 2000 is the customer number. I know from earlier when we looked, there's no 2000 customer. And let's put a date in here. This is a date from the book. When I try to run this, oh, integrity constraint. There's the constraint we just created, the foreign key. It violated. The parent key was not found. There was no parent in the customer table with the customer number of 2000. So that's a problem. Now, that is how you set up a foreign key constraint. Okay, again, remember, make sure you go back through your book, read through it some more to make sure you really understand this concept. Okay, it's going to be very important. Now at this point, I'm also going to show you how to drop a constraint because I'm going to recreate this constraint and add a delete on delete cascade. So I'm going to alter table orders. I'm going to drop constraint. Instead of add constraint, it's drop constraint. Let's specify the constraint name that I just created, that foreign key. Oh, customer number, do I have a, oh, I had a typo. Let's do alter table orders, drop constraint, orders. I missed my S. Let's try that again. Okay, there we go, table altered. I had a typo in there. A lot of times whenever you're doing your queries, you are going to have to do some troubleshooting because you'll definitely have typos and things of that nature that you have to work through. All right, now let's talk about delete cascade. So let's say I wanted to delete a customer from my database. I wanted to delete customer 102020. When I do that, I can't orphan my children records that are on the orders table. So we have order records that are referencing customer 1020. If we delete the parent record, that's going to orphan the children records. We can't have that. So we want to make sure we do a delete on cascade. So if we do have to delete a customer from the customers table, it's also going to delete the children records from the orders table as well. So that there's no records that are out there that don't reference a customer. So to do that, we do our same alter table orders, adding a constraint called orders underscore customer number underscore FK. Same name that we just dropped. I'm going to create a foreign key on customer number again. We're going to reference the customers table and the customer number column, but we're going to add on delete cascade. Now what this will do is if we were to delete a customer number out of the customers table that has references on the orders table, it will also delete those order records. Okay. Last thing I'm going to show you is what happens if we have a foreign constraint on the orders table that references customers and we try to delete the entire customers table. What happens? Oh, can't do that. Unique primary keys in the table referenced by foreign keys. So we can't drop this customer table because there are foreign keys on other tables that reference this table, and we cannot get rid of it yet. Okay, we would have to get rid of the foreign key constraints before we can drop the table customers. All right. Okay, so that's foreign key constraints. Again, make sure you go back and review in your book, and make sure that you really understand that topic. Next constraint, unique. This will be pretty quick. Alter table books. Now, I guess before I get into this, let me explain. Remember, the unique constraint basically tells you, sorry, I can't speak. The unique constraint is going to make it so that a column that you specify has to have unique values. It cannot have duplicate values. The difference between this and a primary key is that in the unique field can be null. So you can have null values in there, whereas a primary key cannot. So let's say in our books table, we want to put a unique constraint on the book name so that the book title has to be unique or the book name has to be unique. So I'm going to alter table books. I'm going to add a constraint called books so that we're referencing the table name, the title, and UK for unique unique key. I'm going to specify the constraint type, which is unique, and then in parentheses, the field or the column that we are adding the constraint to, which is title. Table is altered. Now, if I look in the books table, select all from books, I see that there is a title here called shortest poems. What if I wanted to, if I tried to insert a record into books, ISBN number, title, with the values of the value of shortest poems. If I could spell shortest poems. What if I try to add this? Oh, can't do it because there's a unique constraint that was violated. Books title underscore UK. All right, so that's the unique constraint. Next, the check constraint. The check constraint is used if you want to make sure or ensure that a value is present whenever you try to add a record to a table. You want to make sure that a value is something specific. So as I mentioned earlier, you could say, I want to make sure a certain column has a value greater than 0, or the order date is less than or equal to the ship date. So if I want to alter the table orders, add a constraint called orders ship date underscore CK. So CK is for check constraint. Add my check constraint type. Let's say I want to say order date has to be less than or equal to the ship date, because you can't ship something before you order it, right? So we're adding that constraint in here. Table is now altered. So that is going to say if we try to insert a record into the orders table and the order date is less than the ship date, it's going to throw a check constraint violation. Okay. We can also do, as another example, alter table orders. We can add a constraint. Let's call it customer. Actually, let's change the table here. Let me just end that one. Alter table customers. Add constraint customers region check. Now I'm going to say when the region is in northwest, northeast, south, southeast, southwest, west, and east. So this is another type of check constraint, and there's a whole list of these in your book, so make sure you look at all of these. This is saying that whenever I add a region to my table, it has to be one of these values in this list right here. If it's not in this list, it's going to throw an error. Oh, I'm missing my right parentheses. Let me try this again. Alter table, customers. I'm just going to copy and paste this. Oh, I know what I did wrong. I forgot my parenthesis in this list. When you use in, you have to have the values are in these parentheses right here. I've forgotten a parenthesis. Now the table is altered. Okay. Now, so that is your check constraint. Now we're going to move on to not nulls. Now, I already kind of showed you when you create a table, you can specify a column level constraint here for not nulls. But if you wanted to alter a table and add a not null, here's how you do it. Alter table. Let's say we're going to do orders, the orders table. Now we're going to modify the table. Now we're going to modify customer number, and we're going to add a constraint on the customer number called, we're going to name it orders customer number underscore NN, not null. So we're going to say that on the orders table, the customer number field cannot be null. Now, when we insert a record, customer number has to have a value on the orders table. Okay. All right. Last few things here. We're going to talk about creating tables. Again, there's two different ways you can add constraints when you're creating a table. The only difference is where you put the constraints in your create table command. So it's essentially the exact same thing, it's just slightly modifying where you specify. So it's just two different ways you can do it. I'm going to start by doing the table level create table creation. Create table. Okay, so create table, let's call it department. And then in parentheses, I'm going to put my columns. So department ID, I have to specify a data type. Call this one a number. I'm going to say the department name is a varchar2. It can be 20 characters. Now I'm going to specify a not null here because I can add that here at this time. And then I can do facts, varchar2. I'm going to make it 12. I'm going to put a parenthesis there, varchar2 12. And now, let's say those are the three columns I'm going to add to my table. Now let's say I want to put some constraints in there. Okay, so I'm going to put constraint. I'm going to call this department ID, PK. What's PK for? Primary key. And I'm going to call department ID my primary key. Now I'm also going to add a constraint to this table called department dname UK. What's that for? Dname. UK is for a unique. So we want to make sure the department name is unique. Now I'm going to close remember I have my starting parenthesis up here. I'm going to close, I've specified the dname is going to be unique, department ID is going to be the primary key, and I'm going to close my last parenthesis up here. So now I have all of my column names listed. Okay. And with my semicolon, oh, name is already in use by an existing object. I might have had this from before. Let me drop table department. Okay, now the table's dropped. And to save time, I'm just going to go back in here and add these back in quickly. Let's run this again. Now the table's created. Okay, so now I have my department, department table with my three fields that I specified. Okay, so that's one way to create a table. The other way, let me drop that table again. The other way is by doing column level. We're going to create table department. Now, when we start creating our columns here, number 2, my data type, I'm going to specify a constraint right here as I'm specifying the column. Take a quick drink of water. Excuse me, sorry about that. Where were we? So department ID, PK, primary key. So right there on the column, when I'm specifying this column, I go ahead and add the constraint there, as opposed to doing it at the table level after I've already specified my 3 columns. Okay. So I got my primary key now, and then I'm going to do my dname, which is going to be varchar 220, and I'm going to make it not null. And then I'm going to add a constraint here called department dname UK unique. Okay, so now I've specified it's not null and it's going to have a constraint on it called unique. And then my third field is going to be my facts, which is varchar2, and it's going to be 12 digits, or 12 characters, I should say. Close on my parentheses, and now the table is created. Same thing, same table created, just the 2 different ways to create the constraints. Okay? All right, so that gets us through all of the different constraints that we can do. Primary key, foreign key, unique key, check, and not null. And we've talked about how to alter it, how to create the constraints when you create the table, modifying the table, how to drop a constraint by altering the table. Now, let me quickly show you how you can view the constraints. And it's going to be kind of difficult to see. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste this to save some time where I don't type them all out. Your book has these examples, by the way. So I'm going to
select, there's two different tables I can select from. User underscore constraints, where the table name equals customers. Now, again, it's hard to see in this. You'll be able to see it better when we start using SQL Developer. But this is listing out the different constraints for the customer table. So we have, you see this is assist, this is a uh, a system-generated constraint name. And you'll see it's for last name is not null, because when we ran our query to create this database, we didn't specify a constraint name for these. So it generated one automatically. Now, if I scroll down here to the bottom, I can see where I added in this constraint, customers region CK, with my region. And I have another one here for my primary key. Now, you'll see there's a P here and a C here. These are, so P is for primary key, C is for a check constraint. There would be a U for a unique constraint, and so on and so forth. So that's one way you can view it. You can view the constraints. What you can't really see in this table is what column name it's actually referencing. So you can do a select constraint name and column name from the user cons columns table. This is another Oracle Data Dictionary table where the table name equals customers. This will show me that, okay, for this primary key constraint, I'm referencing the customer number. For this is the not null constraint, last name. Now you can see why this naming convention makes it hard to know what type of constraint this is. Whereas I named this one myself, I know that, hey, this is a primary key constraint, and this is a check constraint on region. So those are two ways you can see your constraints in your tables. All right. Last thing I'm going to show you here is how to enable and disable a constraint. So sometimes you may want to disable a constraint if you were trying to run or insert some sort of data. And sometimes when you have constraints in your database, if you're working with a large amount of data, it can actually really slow your database down because it's trying to check all of these constraints. So every now and then it's useful to disable a constraint so that you can do something with your database and then re-enable the constraint. So if you didn't want to disable a constraint, you alter the table. So if, let's say I want to disable constraint, the orders ship date check. This is where I made sure that the ship date was less than, I'm sorry, the order date was less than or equal to the ship date. I can just do disable constraint to disable it. I can do alter table orders, enable constraint, and then put my constraint name in. It would help if I spelled it correctly. Alter table orders, enable constraint, orders, ship date, CK, table alter. Now my constraint is enabled again. Okay, so that is it. I know that was a lot in a short amount of time. Again, can't stress this enough. Make sure you read through your book, your textbook, to get all the details about this. But this should get you to where you can feel pretty comfortable about completing your homework. So just as a quick summary, we've talked about how to create primary keys, foreign keys, unique keys, check constraints, unique constraints, not null constraints, how to modify them on an existing table, how to create them on a new table, both column level and table level. And hopefully also showed you some examples of how those constraints are actually working. We also talked about how to view the constraints on the tables using the Oracle Data Dictionary, and then enabling and disabling the constraints. Okay, I think that's it. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm always here to help. And thank you, and I will talk to you all soon.